All right, let's dive into something that's the absolute bedrock of any scholarly work: academic ethics. We're going to be using Mohammed AbdEllah's work, Academic Writing, as our guide, because it does a fantastic job of explaining why this is so much more than just a list of rules. It's about the trust that all knowledge is built on.
This one sentence really just nails it. Think of academic ethics as a moral compass for anyone doing research. It's not just about what you shouldn't do, it's about actively protecting the values that give academic work its meaning and its authority. So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll talk about this foundation of trust and the pillars that hold it up. Then, we'll look at the dishonest acts that can completely shatter that trust, with a special focus on plagiarism. And finally, we'll get into the very real consequences of breaking these rules. Okay, so let's start with the big idea. Every single research paper, every study, every book, it all rests on a foundation of trust. The values we're about to get into are what guarantee its integrity. Without them, the whole house of cards just collapses. Now, what's really cool is how the book frames these values. They're not just, good ideas. They're three essential pillars. If even one of them is shaky, that whole foundation of trust we just talked about is at risk. And here are the big three: honesty, transparency, and fairness. These are the absolute cornerstones of ethical academic work, and they all work together. You can't really have one without the others. So let's take a closer look at each one. First up, and you could argue it's the most important one, is honesty. The source is crystal clear on this. In the world of academia, honesty means you do not, under any circumstances, manipulate your data. It's a huge deal, and for a very good reason. And this slide really breaks down how you can violate that honesty. Fabrication is just making stuff up. Falsification is tweaking or leaving out data you already have. Data dredging is like torturing the data until it confesses to something that isn't true. And misinterpretation is when you deliberately present it all in a misleading way. Each of these things poisons the well for everyone. Our second pillar is transparency, and it's really all about showing your work. You have to be open about your methods, where you got your data, and how you analyzed it. If you hide your process, nobody can check your findings, and your credibility is just gone. And notice that last part. Disclosing your use of AI tools is now a non-negotiable part of being transparent. And pillar number 3, fairness, is really all about respect. It means you give credit where credit is due. See, knowledge is like a long conversation happening over centuries, and citing your sources is how you show you've been listening. It's about being a good citizen in the academic community. Which brings us to a really important question. We've seen how to build this foundation of trust, but what happens when someone consciously decides to just take a sledgehammer to it? So now we're getting into the stuff you absolutely cannot do. These aren't just little slip-ups. The book calls them violations that can, and frequently do, destroy careers. The source flags these 4 as the big ones, and while they're all incredibly serious, we're going to spend a little more time on plagiarism because it's one of the most common and honestly most misunderstood forms of academic cheating. This is so critical to understand. The book doesn't call it borrowing, it calls it theft. When you plagiarize, you are stealing intellectual property. You're stealing someone's ideas, their words, their hard work. The language is strong because the act is that serious. Now, the source makes a really smart distinction here. There's unintentional plagiarism, which usually comes from being sloppy or just not knowing the rules. It's a serious mistake, but a mistake. But then there's deliberate plagiarism, which the book calls a planned crime. That's a conscious choice to deceive, and the consequences are way more severe. And you have to know, plagiarism can look like a lot of different things. It can be the obvious copy and paste job, but it can also be rephrasing someone's idea without giving them credit. Mosaic plagiarism is when you weave together bits and pieces from a bunch of sources. And yeah, you can even plagiarize yourself if you reuse old work without citing it. Next up is ghost writing. I mean, this is basically fraud for hire. Somebody pays, somebody else writes, and the person who paid slaps their name on it. The book is clear that in this crime, both the buyer and the writer are putting their entire academic and professional futures on the line. And the last major act of dishonesty is collusion. You can just think of this as any kind of teamwork that isn't allowed. It might be 2 students working on a solo exam, or researchers sharing data when they shouldn't be. No matter what, it creates an unfair advantage and it undermines the whole point. So, we've gone over the values you need to have and the acts you need to avoid. But to really get why this matters so much, we have to look at the consequences. This is where it all gets very, very real. Academic integrity just isn't optional. And the penalties, they're severe. It can start with failing a class, sure, but it can escalate fast to getting kicked out of your university. Out in the professional world, it can get you fired and ruin your reputation. And sometimes, especially with plagiarism, you could even face a lawsuit for copyright infringement. The stakes are incredibly high. But beyond all the punishments, the source makes a much deeper point about the work itself. When something is built on lies, on stolen or made-up content, what does it actually contribute? What is it worth? Well, the answer is pretty simple.
This quote just says it all, doesn't it? Even if someone gets away with it, even if they get a good grade or a promotion, the work itself is worthless. It adds nothing new to human knowledge. At its core, it has no value. It's empty. And this all leaves us with one final big question to think about. In a world with AI and where you can find information instantly, upholding these principles of honesty and fairness is more important than ever. So what is the true value of your own original thought? Because that's what academic integrity is all about protecting.